once visible for miles from land, sea, and air. Now, only smoke from the battered Twin Towers looming over New York.
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists.
He's not mincing words. George W. Bush prepares America for a prolonged anti-terrorism campaign.
And bagpipes wailing a tribute to men who sacrificed their lives in the line of duty.
From the CNN Center in Atlanta, I'm Relitza Vasilova.
And I'm Jim Clancy. This is CNN's continuing coverage of America's new war. Well, crews in Lower Manhattan have located a chilling clue. They've discovered a passport belonging to one of the suspected hijackers. It was found several blocks from the crash site, prompting investigators to widen the search area. In another development Saturday, the FBI said it had arrested a second person on a material witness warrant. And meanwhile, rescue, recovery, and cleanup crews are working full steam through the night. The list of the missing has swelled to nearly 5,000. 159 bodies have been recovered from the devastated site. The Justice Department releasing more information about the alleged hijackers and the terrorist network thought to have sponsored Tuesday's attacks. CNN has obtained photos of 8 of those suspected hijackers. From American Airlines Flight 11, which hit the World Trade Center's North Tower, Mohammed Atta, Walid al-Shehri, Abdul Aziz al-Omari, and Walid al-Shehri. From the United Airlines Flight 175, which hit the World Trade Center's South Tower, Marwan al-Shehhi. And from United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in rural Pennsylvania, Saeed al-Ghamdi, Ahmed al-Haznawi, and Ziad Samir Jarrah.
187 people are now missing and presumed dead in the attack on the Pentagon. U.S. defense officials say the damage to the structure will be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. They say they don't expect to find anyone alive in the rubble. On Saturday, the Pentagon announced the first confirmed death in the attack. Edward Thomas Earhart of Salt Lake, Kentucky, was 26 years old. And the latest on the Pentagon investigation now, 2 suspected hijackers aboard the plane that slammed into the Pentagon were already under U.S. government surveillance. Authorities say one of them was seen on a surveillance tape meeting with a suspect in the bombing of the USS Cole.
The Cole bombing, of course, took place last October in Yemen. Suicide bombers in a small boat pulled up alongside the ship, saluted, and then detonated their charges.
U.S. officials said from the start that they suspected associates of Osama bin Laden. Eileen O'Connor takes a look now at the Cole connection.
They booked the tickets on American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington to Los Angeles on Travelocity, using a New Jersey address, mailboxes, etc. And names U.S. officials confirm were known to them: Khalid al-Midhar and Salim al-Hamzi. Once on board, together with al-Hamzi's brother and an old roommate, a known pilot, they took over the flight, crashing it into the Pentagon. Within minutes, the facade of a symbol of American strength crumbled. As the search and rescue efforts continue, sources say the FBI was informed that Khalid al-Midhar and Salim al-Hamzi were associated with Osama bin Laden and the bombing of the USS Cole. One source confirms they had concrete evidence al-Midhar had met with a man who was later involved in the attack on the Cole.
One was kind of short and the other 2 was tall.
Al-Midhar was a frequent visitor of al-Hamzi and his brother Nawak in the San Diego apartment complex.
They was always together. If they left, it was together. They come back, they're together.
They hung out a lot at the pool, despite telling their neighbors they were studying at a nearby college.
You'll see 3 of them in the pool swimming, or you'll see the dude always looking out the window, another one outside the door on the phone.
At one point, they left, telling one landlord they were in Arizona, living in different cities at different addresses. As it turns out, rooming with another hijacker aboard that plane, Hani Hanjour. Hani attended this flying school, CRM, Cockpit Resource Management, but left without a certification.
He's kind of a waste of time. He wouldn't show up for flights on time, didn't do his homework.
Not a promising student, but skilled enough to carry out the mission. Eileen O'Connor, CNN, Washington.
The U.S. Defense Department is mobilizing to secure potential targets throughout the U.S. Military leaders are calling it Operation Noble Eagle. CNN's Mark Potter joins us now from the Pentagon in Washington. Mark.
Good morning, Ralitza. There's a report today in the Washington Post that's causing a lot of interest here at the Pentagon. It says that Pentagon officials were caught by surprise by the hijacked jet that crashed into the building last Tuesday. According to the newspaper, the Federal Aviation Administration told the nation's military air defense command that a hijacked plane was heading toward Washington. That was 12 minutes before the plane hit the Pentagon. Fighter jets were scrambled immediately. But according to the paper, the Washington Post, at the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and his top aides were unaware of the potential danger until the impact of the plane. And those in charge of guarding the building were not told and didn't order an evacuation. This morning, a spokesman for the U.S. Air Force would not comment on that report. Now, here at the Pentagon this morning, workers continue to dig through the rubble, searching for victims as they have been doing for several days, 24 hours a day. They're shoring up the building. The search for the victims progresses. And earlier, the Pentagon released another video, a very dramatic video that was shot by a tech sergeant from the Air Force on the day that the plane hit, right after the plane hit, and it shows the building collapsing in on itself in the area hit by the plane. They also released a video showing the inside of the structure, showing the massive damage. It also provides evidence of the human toll, proving, of course, what we know, that people were working here at the time that the plane hit. The jet struck an area of the Pentagon that had just been renovated and had been reinforced, and officials say that was fortuitous because it reduced the damage and may have saved many lives.
This was a terrible tragedy, and people lost their lives. But I'm here to tell you that had we not undertaken this effort in the building, this could have been much, much worse.
Now, the death toll here is believed to be 188. That's 124 personnel from the Pentagon, 64 passengers aboard the airliner. Now, grieving families of the victims were allowed to come by the Pentagon crash site, and they were escorted in. They were brought in buses, escorted by police, and taken care of by military officials. They were allowed to leave flowers and mementos at the site, near the site, and for many it appeared to be a very emotional moment. Meanwhile, the Pentagon prepares to call up 35,000 reservists for what it is calling Operation Noble Eagle, a mission to provide homeland defense and disaster relief. Back to you.
Mark, we heard President Bush telling Americans to prepare for war. There are warnings about risks that lie ahead, not only for the American troops that might be involved, but also for American civilians. What kind of preparations are being made for their protection?
Well, we don't really know that. We know that the Pentagon is working on this issue, of course, as you might expect, but the details are few and far between. We are not getting into any indication that that an attack is imminent, but we are being told that the Pentagon it expects that it is a mission that could take casualties. That's been a concern in the past, and a reason not to have extended military campaigns. But this time, because this was an attack on the United States, military officials are telling CNN that it is acceptable to receive casualties. It is something that would not thwart them in an extended and long-term campaign. Excuse me. Back to you.
Mark, thank you. And President Bush met with members of his national security team at Camp David Saturday to discuss the U.S. response to Tuesday's attacks. Speaking at the meeting, the president's message was unequivocal.
They will try to hide. We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly. And I appreciate very much the American people understanding that.
In his weekly radio address, Mr. Bush said he was planning a broad and sustained campaign, but asked the American people to be patient. Jim.
Ralitza, President Bush also said that Osama bin Laden would be, in his words, sorely mistaken if he thinks he can hide from the United States. Mr. Bush also called him the prime suspect, but then later took care to point out other groups may be involved. For more on the Bush team's focus this weekend, let's turn now to Major Garrett. He's in Washington. Major.
Jim, the Bush team's focus is many-layered, multi-dimensional, reviewing target lists, reviewing military options with his top national security advisors. Also, the president is monitoring on a regular basis new developments in the investigation. He met, as you said, this morning with his top national security advisors. Also, the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, all of them providing the latest information to the president. And there's also a very significant effort underway to enlarge the coalition to support this war the president said is about to be declared against global terrorism. There was some encouraging signs for the Bush administration on a couple of fronts on Saturday. One, conversation between the president and Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf to discuss Pakistan's pledge of full cooperation with the United States, including providing vital human intelligence about the possible whereabouts of Osama bin Laden and airspace, should it be required for any military strike the United States might in fact want to carry out within the borders of Afghanistan. Also, the president talked to the presidents of Spain and Mexico, part of his ongoing effort to include other nations in the ever-enlarging coalition the United States hopes to unleash against the perpetrators of the terrorist acts on Tuesday. And in talking to reporters at Camp David, the president said not only that as the nation is at war, but that he promised victory in that war.
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly. And I appreciate very much the American people understanding that. As we plan, as we put our strategy into action, we will let you know when we think it's appropriate, not only for to protect the lives of our servicemen and women, but to make sure our coalition has had proper time to be noticed as well. But we're going to act.
Jim, that response from the president was from persistent questions from reporters out at Camp David about the specifics of military options being weighed. The White House has made clear it's not ruling out anything, not ruling out any military option, including the use of ground troops. And there's also a significant statement the president made there about making sure coalition partners are given advance notice. That's significant in part because on Saturday, the Arab League said it would cooperate and support U.S. military efforts provided it receives some advance notice of what those military efforts in fact would be. Jim?
Major Garrett, there's a lot of questions from people that are being called upon in order to participate in that coalition. One of the major questions seems to be, what are the terms that the Bush administration is laying out here? First of all, let's handle this one. There seems to be a sense that there's a take it, you're either with us or you're against us. And there's a sense here that if you don't participate in this coalition, you could find yourself isolated from this administration. True?
Absolutely true, Jim. This is a clear and defining moment the Bush administration sees for those who have been allies of the United States before in a global pursuit of terrorism and those who have not. The administration is arguing that the world changed, not just America, but the world changed on Tuesday. That this attack against the United States could have just as easily been carried out against many other democratic and what the administration would argue civilized nations around the globe. And if you do not join with the United States now, you will forever, at least in the opinion of the United States, be branded as someone who would not step up to the plate, who would not provide the necessary means to support the United States. And the administration makes it very clear, Jim, that it's not just military support that it's talking about. It is support dealing with finances, finding ways to choke off the financial flow to terrorists, not only Osama bin Laden, but others who may be aligned with him. It's also talking about diplomatic isolation. So this works at many layers: military, diplomatic, financial. Secretary of State Colin Powell said today out at Camp David one thing that I think is significant. He said, "We are receiving expressions of support from around the world, and not just rhetorical support." That's been a huge question. Is this support just words and words only? Secretary of State Powell said at Camp David today, "We're receiving real support for whatever may lay ahead in this campaign." A signal the United States, at least so far, is confident that it's not just going to be rhetoric, but real assets, military, financial, and diplomatic, that will come to bear once it starts this campaign against global terrorism. Jim?
Major Garrett, one more question, just briefly. On the other side, there is a concern among the states that are being called into this coalition that the United States has a history of entering these kinds of things, going into areas it doesn't understand, cultures it doesn't understand, and simply not listening to the advice of its allies. Is this administration ready to not only ask them to come into a coalition, but once they're in it, listen to them, to their counsel?
Well, certainly, Jim, every outward statement from the administration indicates that. And when the president calls upon the country for patience and a sense that this is a multi-layered campaign he is about to wage, I think he's trying to get to some of those nuances. Of course, American history, as you said, is replete with examples of very fast, furious U.S. action, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes ham-handed, and oftentimes it happens, the U.S. pulls back, and everyone is left wondering what the ultimate goal was in the first place. The administration knows it's under considerable pressure on the international front to prove that's not going to be the case this time. It's not promising a miracle or perfection, but it is certainly working to assure those who join this coalition that the U.S. effort will be complete, as nuanced as possible, and, as the president said today, effective. Jim?
All right, Major Garrett there reporting from Washington, the latest. Now, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger saying the attacks show the world can no longer afford to allow countries to shelter and assist any terrorist group. He says the U.S. needs to live up to its word to equally punish those who harbor terrorists, and the response needs to be extensive.
Now that this outrage has been committed, we should not stop until the back of these terrorist networks has been broken.
And now we move on to the latest from the scene of the World Trade Center attacks. We turn to Gary Tuchman in New York, where we've been reporting crews are still in rescue and not recovery mode. Gary.
Ralitza, this is not the first time an airplane is slammed into the tallest building in the United States. The date was July 28, 1945. A U.S. military plane lost in the fog slammed into the 79th story of the Empire State Building, then the tallest building in New York. 14 people were killed. Many people thought history was rewriting itself when they saw a plane smash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center on Tuesday, particularly people over the age of 60 who remembered the 1945 incident. But then another plane slammed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. People realized this was much different. We're showing you pictures shot by a filmmaker who lives 2 blocks away from the World Trade Center, who stepped out on her balcony after the first plane smashed into the building. It's hard to imagine how frightening this must have been for the people inside the building. A plane flying through the top half of the World Trade Center. You can see, if you look very closely, people waving curtains or clothes or sheets. It's hard to tell. But the horror they must have gone through for some of those people to actually jump out of the building instead of waiting there knowing they were falling to a certain death. Now, we are entering the 6th day of the search, and we have a live picture to show you of the hundreds of workers who are still out there around the clock ever since this all happened Tuesday. 4,972 people are still missing. 5 survivors have been found, but they were all found the day of or the day after. No survivors have been found over the last 3 days. One of the finds made today was very sad and very poignant. A dump truck working on the scene pulled out of the rubble a fire truck that said Ladder 18 on it. It was crushed. It was gray from all the rubble. There was no one inside the fire truck, but we have absolutely no idea what happened to the people, the firemen and or the firewomen who drove that truck to the scene. What we do know is time is running out to find any survivors. And we also wanted to mention to you a sad irony. As we mentioned to you, talking about the Empire State Building to start off this report, once again, the Empire State Building is the tallest building in New York City. Ralitza, back to you.
Gary, how long are they holding out hope that survivors, possibly trapped in some pocket, could make it before they are found?
Ralitza, there's certainly precedent for people surviving for many, many days. We've seen that in earthquakes around the world. People trapped under the rubble and after 8 days come out and are still alive. However, there's also precedent in recent American history that isn't so good. The Oklahoma City bombing. They found survivors the day of and the day after, but they didn't find one survivor after that.
Gary, thank you. Jim.
Well, it was a sad scene, and there's going to be so many more of these funeral services where several victims of the attacks were held Saturday in New York City. Hundreds of firefighters and police attended services for Peter Gansey. He's the chief of the New York Fire Department. Gansey, a 33-year department veteran, and the city's first deputy fire commissioner, also remembered Saturday. William Feehan had spent almost 40 years with the department.
Sad. Fire Department chaplain Father Michael Judge was killed by debris from one of the collapsing Twin Towers. Father Judge was eulogized as someone who, quote, loved to be in a crisis so he could insert God into what was going on.
Police officers, firefighters, even journalists regularly risk their lives doing their jobs, but they're not immune from the emotions of harrowing events like Tuesday's. CNN's Richard Blystone reports on one photographer who escaped death twice in his quest to capture the images of the day.
Surgery is going to keep news photographer David Handschuh away from some friends' funerals, but this one he wasn't going to miss. Because in the line of duty, he saw a lot of Father Mike Judge, the firefighter's chaplain, who was killed Tuesday while giving last rites to a fireman.
He would hold your hand and you would just feel good. He emanated some form of just positive goodwill that nobody else I've ever met could. By just touching you, by putting his hand on you and giving you a hug, you just floated away happy.
Many of those in the overflow crowd had narrow escapes that day. David Handschuh had two.
You hear the sound and then the building starts falling down in slow motion. And I'm a photographer. The initial reaction was to raise the camera and take a picture, but something up here said, just run. And in the 20-plus years I've been doing this, I've never once run from anything. But it probably saved my life. The wall of debris that came flying down just picked me up and threw me a block.
One leg shattered, the other torn up. Firemen pulled him to a delicatessen. Another photographer captured that moment, but it wasn't over.
When the second building collapsed, the facade of that building was blown in. We were trapped once again. Using their hands and tools and sheer strength and will, they pushed their way out.
For news photographers, cameramen, reporters, days like that are part of an unwritten contract with life. So too with soldiers, policemen, firemen, which doesn't make it much easier. But the thousands still missing downtown, they didn't sign up for this.
I'm so sorry that so many people lost their lives over this. It's not comprehensible. It's not right.
At the end, the photographer pulled out his camera. It may not make much of a picture, but this one's personal. Richard Blystone, CNN, New York.
Friends remembered lawyer and commentator Barbara Olson at a service Saturday in Washington. Olson was among the 64 passengers and crew who were killed on American Airlines Flight 77, which crashed into the Pentagon. Olson was a frequent contributor to CNN programs and the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas spoke at the service. He said Olson, quote, strode boldly through life, full of cheer and verve, shying from no challenge or obstacle.
We want to give you now the latest from the crash scenes. Rescue, recovery, and cleanup crews continuing to work throughout the night as they have been at the site of the World Trade Center disaster. Saturday, crews pulled a fire truck that was buried in the debris out. 159 bodies have been recovered from the devastated area so far. No survivors were found again on Saturday. Almost 5,000 people are believed lost somewhere in that rubble. Crews also discovered a passport belonging to one of the suspected hijackers. It was found several blocks from the crash site, prompting investigators now to widen their search of the area. Officials at the Pentagon still assessing the damage there. They estimate it will cost hundreds of millions of dollars to repair that building. Now, massive amounts of manpower are being devoted to what the Justice Department calls the Pint Bomb probe. The investigation is the largest in U.S. history. It involves 4,000 FBI agents and more than 3,000 support personnel.
The family of one suspected hijacker is speaking out. They say they're shocked by Tuesday's tragic events and that the man they knew showed no sign of being capable of such atrocities. Brent Sadler has a story.
A possible White House suicide pilot or the face of an innocent passenger, 26-year-old Ziad Jarrah from Lebanon. The United States Justice Department says he was one of the hijackers on United Flight 93, which crashed in a field some 80 miles from Pittsburgh shortly after 3 other jets struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Flight 93, whose passengers might have wrestled the hijackers, causing the plane to crash, could have been targeting the very heart of America and President Bush himself. In Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, though, Ziad Jarrah's family insists there's no hard evidence to prove any of that.
He never acted or talked in a way that you could have an understanding that he might be related to this.
In Germany, investigators now say the Technical University in Hamburg, with its now closed prayer room, is where Jarrah and 2 other alleged hijackers studied. Mohammed Atta, whom US authorities believe was aboard the first plane to hit the World Trade Center, and Marwan al-Shihi, flying in the second aircraft to hit the Twin Towers. Ziad Jarrah's family are Sunni Muslims, well-educated and well-to-do. They spoke of a young man whose personality, they claim, does not fit the profile of an Islamic fundamentalist bent on terror.
He has his girlfriend, he goes to nightclubs, he drinks sometimes. His way of life can't be related to these parts.
Ziad Jarrah's way of life away from home started in Germany. He began to study engineering 4 years ago on courses paid for by proud parents. Around a year ago, he told them he was in the United States, taking part in a Boeing Aircraft Corporation seminar related to his studies. After that, he returned to Hamburg, receiving more help from his parents to study. When he later told them he was in Florida, training as a pilot, they assumed all was well. His last call home came 2 days before the suicide attacks, when he thanked his ailing father for sending more money. His apartment manager says he paid cash weekly for 1-bedroom accommodation and presented a German passport with a student visa. On May 2nd this year, he obtained a Florida driver's license. The same day, another terrorist suspect, Mohammed Atta, got his Florida driver's license. The only time he raised concern, they say, is when his Turkish girlfriend told them she thought he might have gone with friends to Afghanistan while they were separated for several weeks. The family says there's no proof of any trip to Afghanistan and are willing to cooperate with the international inquiry.
What happened is a tragedy, a catastrophe for all people, and we don't agree on these acts, and we are surprised and shocked of what happened.
The Lebanese authorities are stressing that neither the government nor its people at large have any link with the terror attacks against America, regardless of suspicions focused on one of its citizens. Standing ready, say officials here, to cooperate with investigations in any way they can. Brent Sadler, CNN, Beirut.
Crackdowns in Europe have netted several arrests. In Brussels, Belgium, 2 men believed to have been planning an attack on American interests in Europe were charged with possession of weapons of war.
Now, the 2 also face other counts for a total of 4 each. Authorities say they were members of a radical Muslim group and that they may have been part of a possible terrorist network. We get more on this story now from Diana Muriel.
It was at this apartment building in a prosperous part of Brussels that one of the 2 suspects was arrested on Thursday. Fellow residents say they did not know the man, a Tunisian who was charged on Friday on 1 count of criminal association. The other, a Belgian of North African origin, was arrested at another apartment in this district. He has also been charged with criminal association, as well as attempting to destroy property with explosives, being a member of a private militia, and illegal possession of weapons of war. 1 automatic pistol was recovered by the police, together with ammunition and documentation that points to a planned series of attacks on American interests in Europe.
He is strongly suspected to belong to an extremist Islamic movement, but there's nothing to confirm that they belong to the Bin Laden organization. But that's also not being ruled out.
The documents are currently being analysed by the investigating authorities. No details are yet available. But some European media, including the widely respected French newspaper Le Figaro, have identified the American embassy in Paris as one of the targets. The Belgian prosecutor's office believes the two men have links with an unnamed radical Islamic organisation.
At this point, we cannot confirm which country in Europe is being targeted, but the investigation will soon determine that. But there's no doubt the target is American interests.
The arrests in Brussels were part of a joint operation with police in the Netherlands. 4 men were arrested in Rotterdam on Friday. The investigation here into the activities of the two suspects continues. Meanwhile, it is widely expected, although not yet officially confirmed by the authorities here, that 2 French magistrates, specialists in terrorism, will come to Brussels on Monday to consult on the case. Diana Muriel, CNN, Brussels.
Iran says it will take steps to seal its long borders with Afghanistan. Both Iran and Pakistan are at risk of receiving a flood of refugees in the event of a United States military strike on Afghanistan. Some Afghans are already anticipating the strike and leaving their homes. Western aid agencies have already pulled out of Kabul, further worsening the situation for displaced Afghans.
Now, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban continue to assert that Osama bin Laden could not have been involved in these attacks. But the exiled Saudi multimillionaire remains a prime suspect, in the words of President Bush. A little earlier, CNN interviewed a biographer of Osama bin Laden. We asked why bin Laden might target the U.S.
He believes that the Muslim world could have surged and become a leading superpower in the aftermath of the collapse of communism, that Islam could have become the leading political ideology of the world, and that westernization, the penetration of the West, the overwhelming influence of the West, of globalization, etc., prevents it from happening.
Well, the United States is, of course, working to build up international support for any possible military action they might take, and they might be using the Gulf War Coalition as a kind of a model.
And now the target of that operation, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, is offering his perspective on the U.S. attacks and possible retaliation. CNN's Rula Amin has more on that.
Iraq's President Saddam Hussein, in a message to the American people, appealed for serenity.
America needs wisdom, not power. It has used power along with the West to the extreme extent, only to find out later that it doesn't achieve what they wanted. Will the rulers of America try wisdom just for once, so that their people can live in security and stability?
The tone of this letter, read on state television, more muted than his first reaction. The day after Tuesday's attacks, he had said, despite the conflicting human feelings, what happened was a result of America's foreign policy, if the attackers were indeed not Americans, he said. And he pointedly did not condemn the attacks. He's still not condemning them. But this time, he called the attacks evil inflicted on America and called for restraint. He also referred to the harassment of Arab Americans and American Muslims in the United States. He said that despite the pain he says Arabs and Muslims have suffered from the United States, he says they never harassed Westerners who walked in the streets of Baghdad and other Arab capitals. In his 12-page letter, Saddam Hussein questioned the motives of any military attack, and although he acknowledged U.S. might, he questioned the use of it.
We ask again, America aiming the fire of its weapons on a specific target, harming it or destroying it with the support of the West, would it solve the problem?
The official newspapers, which had withheld comments since Tuesday, echoed the same line. As for Iraqis, the government wouldn't allow us to interview them. Iraqis blame the United States for their 10 years of suffering under UN sanctions. They also remember the loss of lives they suffered during the Gulf War.
The people we talked to off camera had conflicting feelings. On one hand, they were satisfied to see the American government under attack. On the other hand, they sympathized with the victims. They told us they know very well what's it like to be one.
But mostly, they don't believe Iraq was involved and fear the United States will use the attacks as an excuse to hit Iraq. Many say, with the unlimited support the U.S. has now, the United States won't have to show solid proof if it decides that Iraq has either lent a hand to the attackers or supported other terrorists. And that, again, the Iraqi people will be under the fire of U.S. might. Rula Amin, CNN, Baghdad.
Many people in the Arab world, from political leaders to the ordinary citizens on the streets, have been rocked by Tuesday's tragic events, not only because of the terrorism, the massive loss of life, but also wondering how will it affect them. Well, joining us now to get some reaction from the Arab community is Abdulbari Atwan. He's the editor-in-chief of the London-based Arab newspaper Al-Quds. Measure for us, if you will, the sentiment in the Arab world, the U.S. president calling on them to take part in a coalition, and the risks.
Well, actually, there are a great deal of confusion in the Arab world. You have the government in one hand and the people on the other hand. And there is a huge gap between governments and people simply because these governments are not elected. There is no democracy. And this gap widened during the intifada of the Palestinians for the last 12 years. Now, the Arabs actually have a great deal of sympathy with the victims of these bombings in Washington and New York. But the problem is they have a lot of buts. You know, these parts is, you know, why, for example, the American don't pay any sympathy when our people are dying, why the American administration didn't intervene to put an end to these sanctions, to atrocities which committed on the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Again, the governments are willing to help United States. The governments, they don't have any other choices, simply because most of Middle Eastern government, as I said, you know, either financed by United States or actually relying on United States military protection, especially in the Gulf. So these countries are willing to help United States.
All right. But given that gap between the two sides, certainly the Arab world is cognizant that the U.S. Came to the assistance of Kuwait. No, they don't like the sanctions. There's a variety of opinions out there. But as they take part in any coalition here, is it putting anybody at risk?
Oh, yes, definitely. You know, people in the streets actually, okay, and maybe a great deal of them supported what's happened to actually push out Iraqi troops from Kuwait. But the problem, they waited for 10 years hoping that the American will implement exactly the UN Security Council on the Arab-Israeli conflict. So they didn't. Say this really left a lot of bitterness among the Arab people in the streets there. So now I think there could be a risk. This kind of, you know, government, the Arab government support to United States against a Muslim fellow country, which is extremely destroyed, could create a lot of rifts, could create a lot of destabilization for these moderate regimes. Simply because, you know, say what? Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to ask you, I guess kind of a bottom line measure might be this.
Yes.
If someone in the Arab community, in the Gulf or in the Middle East had information about a terror group, we know a lot of this so-called war is really going to be an intelligence war. Do you think they'd come forward with it?
Well, it depends where is this person standing. If he is with the Arab governments, definitely he will supply his governments with this information in order to pass it to the American intelligence. But if this man actually on the streets, he will say, look, why shall I do this? It depends. If he belongs to Islamic minorities, you know, fundamentalist group, definitely he wouldn't be helpful. You know what, I want to warn of something which is extremely important. It depends on how long this war it will take. If it is going to be a prolonged war, definitely it will create a lot of stability in the Middle East. Definitely it will destabilize moderate regimes. It could create could fuel the, you know, extremism in the Arab world. And if there are, you know, sort of, you know, civilian casualties here, it is, you know, it could be a cornerstone. So actually we have to look at the Muslim frustration from the American foreign policies and try to understand this. Without understanding this frustration, it could be really, you know, risky for American and for the West. And on top of that, we have a huge Western and American communities in the Middle East. You know, so we have to differentiate between you know, those extremists and ordinary people. And I'm glad Western leaders actually were first to differentiate between extremism and the Arab and Muslim community in the United States and the West, because without that it could reflect badly on those Western people in the height of action or height of, you know, civilian casualties. So I hope Western leaders will be very careful.
Abdulbari, do you have the impression, you know, the Bush administration says it wants to go ahead with a coalition and bring these people in, but a comment that I've heard from the Arab side is, but how much will you really listen when we tell you, look, you don't understand this, this isn't the way to attack this problem? Do you think the Bush administration will listen, and what will happen if they don't?
You know, the Bush administration made a grievous mistake, a very, actually deep mistake when they didn't listen to the moderate Arabs who were calling them to intervene on the Middle East. They turned back completely to the Middle East. They undermined the frustration, or they misunderstood that, or understood that frustration among the people from the American foreign policies. Now I think it is time to listen. It is time to actually show a lot of sympathy toward the Arab grievances and Arab resentment toward the American policies. If they do that, it could help. But actually with turning their back to these grievances, the deep root of the problems between the Arab and the American, definitely this will play to the hands of the extremists, and definitely it will create the suitable atmosphere for them to cultivate, to mobilize, to recruit more radical elements among the Arabs, frustrated people.
All right. Abdul Bari Atwan, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks as always for your perspectives in this. Well, India is giving its support to the United States. Indian External Affairs Minister Yashwant Singh says his country will stand with the U.S. in its fight against terrorism.
What India stands for is really the establishment of a concert of democracies against terrorism, unified in purpose and in resolve. Because as President Bush quite rightly has pointed out, that the issue is really addressing ourselves to the system, that mentality which gives birth to these kinds of attitudes. It is not as if an individual has declared war against a great country like United States of America, and United States is in turn declaring war against an individual. It is the system that gives rise to all these tendencies.
That was Jaswant Singh talking to us by video phone. He told CNN New Delhi's government has met with some opposition parties who are supporting the fight against terrorism.
Russia is moving closer to supporting the United States if it chooses military action in response to Tuesday's attacks, and the Kremlin has another message for Washington. We told you so. CNN's Jill Doherty explains.
Russia is telling the West, we tried to tell you. Terror in the United States or terror in Russia. It's all controlled by international terrorist organizations, they say. The #1 criminal suspect in both countries, Osama bin Laden. The FSB, successor to the KGB, tells CNN it knew where bin Laden was hiding before the attacks on the U.S. and informed other special services. He's since changed his location, the FSB says, but is still in Afghanistan. And the agency vows to find out where he is and inform its Western colleagues.
Russia has never tried to kill Osama bin Laden. We usually deal with infiltrating criminals, arresting them and turning them over to the courts to be punished. That's what I think should be done. However, we have experience where when a suspect offers armed resistance, in order to avoid casualties, it is possible to kill him.
President Vladimir Putin says he's been warning the West since he took office that there is a worldwide network of fanatical terrorists funded primarily by drug money. They're fighting in Chechnya, he claims, and are responsible for a wave of apartment house bombings that hit Russia 2 years ago. But the West, Moscow says, spent too much time scolding Russia for how it dealt with the threat.
I think now they understand that it is not just our internal issue. It's a problem for the entire international community.
Evil must be punished, says the Russian president.
But we should not become like bandits that act from behind a corner. We should consider our decisions and proceed from true facts.
The attacks in the United States, he says, could be compared in scale and cruelty to what the Nazis were perpetrating. I feel guilty for what has happened, Vladimir Putin says. We spoke so much about this threat, but apparently not enough. Jill Doherty, CNN, Moscow.
Well, the attacks and the ensuing fallout have hit the airline industry especially hard.
You know, the airlines are saying they're losing millions of dollars, and though they're now flying again, all are operating on reduced schedules. As Bruce Francis tells us, it's led to one announcing massive layoffs, and it seems others are certain to follow.
Continental Airlines says it is furloughing 12,000 employees, more than a fifth of its workforce, as it cuts 20% of its schedule.
Continental's just getting early. We're not going to be bankrupt first, I'll tell you that, but we're going to be first to move to prevent it, and I think that's a prudent thing to do.
Northwest is also cutting its schedule by 20%, although it hasn't announced any job reductions. Most airlines are flying reduced schedules right now, but at a heavy loss. The airline industry has been losing as much as $275 million a day since Tuesday's terrorist attacks. And even with most airports now open, the outlook is bleak, with passengers reluctant to fly. Airlines face further constraints as pilots are called up for military reserve. At the same time, the carriers are paying for increased security measures. That's why Bethune and others are calling for a government bailout.
I now, and we all of us, call on the President of the United States and members of our Congress to take immediate action to restore the stability of this vital industry.
A first attempt in Congress to provide $15 billion in assistance has failed. If the money is eventually approved, it may come too late for some airlines. Midway has already folded, and 7 of the top 10 U.S. airlines lost money in the second quarter. Prior to the attacks, the industry was on a course to lose $2 billion this year. Analysts now say that could soar to $10 billion.
The financial situation is such that I really expect 3 to 4 small carriers to file for bankruptcy in the coming weeks, and for the major airlines actually to lay off people. So it's a downward spiral.
Airline chiefs will get their chance to voice their concerns directly to the Bush administration. Next week, they're going to sit down with Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta, potentially on the agenda, beefing up security without scaring away an already nervous public. Bruce Francis, CNN Financial News, New York.
The New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ are scheduled to reopen for business on Monday. Now, tests that were conducted yesterday showed that the data and communication systems are operable, even though the New York Stock Exchange was only about 2 blocks away from the Twin Towers when they were hit. Now, the market's set to reopen 9:30 Monday morning. Members of the New York City Police and Fire Departments, Emergency Medical Service, and others are going to be there. They're going to be ringing the opening bell as one way of honoring those who lost their lives Tuesday.
And the attacks on the World Trade Center left thousands of families with more questions than answers, more worries than certainties. And as CNN's Candy Crowley learned, both the pain and the hope come from not knowing.
Yes, Dan? Yes, this is David Vinson.
He's an Eastman Kodak executive from Webster, New York. A man with a problem to solve, a man on a mission.
How is it being set up so that I can make the best use of my time? Because you're working a timeline here. You have to get to your daughter as fast as you can.
Melissa is missing. She's a technology recruiter at Alliance Consulting.
But we know that that's 102nd floor of Tower 1.
The enormity of what's happened in David Vinson's life shows on his face, but does not slow his step.
Please take a picture. Please focus on the picture. To get her face out there so that
working on 3 hours sleep and a couple of crackers, he protects his fondest hopes, battles his worst fears, and sometimes loses.
I don't have any video of her. To be honest with you, Melissa didn't like to be videoed. She used to holler at me every time I did. I'd give anything to ever holler at me right now.
I'd give anything, he says, to have her holler at me right now. It's a rare lapse. Mostly, there is a desperate monotony to his mission.
I know she made a 911 call at 9:02:07.
It's all that David Vincent knows about what happened to his eldest daughter. It's enough to hang hope on.
When we went back to the cell phone provider, the only thing that we had that they could tell us is that there was a 911 call made from that cell phone at 9:02, which was some 17 minutes after the jet had piled into the thing.
9:02:07. He tells it to everyone he talks to. He clings to it for dear life, because of course it is.
I need to know where she was when she made that call, because that will tell me whether she was downstairs just getting off the path and maybe in a void someplace downstairs, or whether I have to understand that she was upstairs on 102 and have to wonder whether she was able to get out or not able to get out.
By evening, David Vincent has pretty much worn out the corner of 26th and Lexington, and his cell battery is fading, so he moves on. Craig Spitzer is CEO of Alliance. 7 employees, everyone thought to be in the building that morning, are missing. He cannot, will not, bring himself to believe they're gone.
I'm not going to say that to you right now.
You can't?
No, and I won't. And I won't for myself, and I won't for the people in there.
In there is a room full of people who have loved someone too long to give up so soon, and what's left after hope is unthinkable. It is why they agreed to expose this rawest of human times to the glare of the camera lens, because maybe somebody out there has information about Roland, something that will keep his brother moving.
I go to sleep with hope, I wake up with none.
And perhaps somebody saw Eric in a stairwell racing to safety.
We don't know, maybe he's out there someplace, got hit on the head and he doesn't know who he is. You know, maybe he's unconscious and he didn't have any identification on him.
And as it turns out, nobody can say for sure that Melissa was in the office for that 8:30 meeting.
I have to tell you, Craig, that's the best news that I could possibly hear, because what you're telling me is you can't confirm Melissa in that office space, and that's what I had to know. Yeah. That's what keeps me going.
So if you know anything about Melissa, call her father. He'd give anything to hear her holler at him again. Candy Crowley, CNN, New York.
People in the United States and around the world continue to mourn the loss of those killed in Tuesday's terrorist attacks. In New York, thousands of people are still buried in what was the Twin Towers. Some of them spent their final moments telling family and friends goodbye. Here is one such story from Austin, Texas. We apologize. People in the United States and around the world continue to mourn the loss of those killed in Tuesday's terrorist attacks. In New York, thousands of people are still buried in what was the Twin Towers. Here is one such story from Austin, Texas.
My brother was probably the kindest, nicest person I ever knew. He was the best friend I ever had. The moment that the plane crashed into the building, he left me a message.
Hi, Casey, it's Chad. Something horrible has happened here. It sounds like an earthquake or typhoon, but everything's on fire. Casey, I know I'm about to die. Please tell Mom I love her dearly, and I love you and Jody too. Please forgive me for everything I've ever done to hurt you. I didn't think about the good times.
What happened when somebody bombed the World Trade Center? They didn't just bomb a building. They touched human lives, and he was a part of my life. And he was someone that I loved so much. And I know he loved me too. I feel like someone took something from me that never should have been taken from me, ever.
Nearly 5,000 people are believed to be still missing in New York as search and rescue efforts are ongoing. For friends and relatives looking for their loved ones, the focus of their search has been on the Manhattan Armory, where details of the missing are being registered. Michael Okwu joins us now from there with the latest. Michael.
Really, there's a sense of complete weariness and a sense of exhaustion that has gripped this city. So many people have shed so many tears. And in the coming days, no doubt, you will start hearing words and phrases that are used so often at times like this that they ring in your ears like cliches: resolution, moving forward, a return to normalcy. But the fact is, for so many, many people, those friends and family members connected to those who were buried under the ash and rubble of the World Trade Center, they will not be returning to normalcy. They try to find some kind of resolution here at the Armory on Lexington Avenue and 26th Street. Here is the emotional ground zero. They essentially fill out a 7-page form where they are supposed to supply identifiable traits of their loved ones, everything from recognizable scars to the kind of nail polish they like to wear. Then they're either put on the list of bodies that were taken to the hospital or officially entered on the list of the missing. Since Thursday, 3,100 people have filed past these doors. Yesterday, the New York City Health Department announced the fact that a medical lab company by the name of LabCorp is offering free DNA collections, which could ultimately help rescue workers identify the bodies. They are asked to provide toothbrushes, hairbrushes, samples of saliva from the closest blood relatives, anything that might have been used exclusively by that person who is missing that might be able to help them connect something and therefore identify these people. Early last night, or late last night I should say, I spoke to a young woman whose godmother is missing.
This is the only way that they can identify, so we've come in with hairbrushes, toothbrushes. Her brother took a saliva sample for DNA, and everyone's willing to do anything, but it's just a matter of waiting.
While so many of us wonder what's next, obviously there are a few people out there who are still very much focused on perhaps what was. Ralitza?
Michael, thank you. And we will have more of CNN's continuing coverage of America's new war at the top of the hour. For now, we leave you with images of heartbreak, healing, and hope. I'm Ralitza Vasilova.
And I'm Jim Clancy.